turn it over to you.
Awesome. Thank you so much for the warm intro, Hannah. It's really lovely to be back in the Innovate US space. And hello to all of you. Thanks for joining today. I'm really excited to talk to you about one of my favorite frameworks, the Opportunity Solution Tree. And Hannah shared a little bit about me, but I'll share a little bit more. I'm Stephanie. I use she, her pronouns. And like Hannah said, I've spent the majority of my career in the public sector. In addition to doing consultant work, I'm also the interim president of the board for Technologists for the Public Good. And a small plug for TPG, if you're not familiar, we're a professional association for technologists that serve the public good. And you can check us out at publicgood.tech. We would absolutely love for you to join our community. My skill set spans design, research, or product. Something I want to say up front is that I'm not a psychiatrist, and that will become relevant later, I promise. But here's what you can expect for the next hour. Once I get through these initial few slides, I'm going to talk about my mental model for approaching tough decisions in government for about 30 minutes. I have a lot of information to share, and I talk fast. So please don't worry, because like Hannah said, this is being recorded and will show up on the Innovate US website soon. And by the way, if you haven't checked out the Innovate US website, I would highly recommend it. There's a ton of great content created by public professionals for public professionals. So take a look. And of course, we'll leave time at the end for any questions, and then give Hannah 5 minutes at the very, very end so that we can wrap up. Today's workshop is about orienting towards outcomes and making decisions in complex scenarios using the framework, the Opportunity Solution Tree. But before we get into the details of that framework, I'm going to tell you about a few cognitive biases that can influence the way that we approach decision making. Please feel free to pop questions in the chat as we go so you don't lose them. I'm also going to be covering some basic concepts of design thinking and software development. But if these are familiar to you, please stick around because I promise to dive deeper into more complex topics. Okay, last intro slide before we jump into it. I want to acknowledge that there is no one right way to approach a problem, and you do not have to religiously follow the rules of any given framework as its creator wrote it. Instead, I really encourage you to be flexible and creative and to apply the principles in ways that help you process information and make decisions more effectively. So remember, all frameworks are made up. You can absolutely make them up too. But that being said, trying something new is always hard the first time. And when you try to apply the Opportunity Solution Tree, you will probably struggle. And that struggle is valid and important. This framework is really about illuminating the mental shortcuts that what we might be making, and being uncomfortable is kind of the point. And then the last acknowledgement is about teams. Having diverse and psychologically safe teams is really valuable for a number of reasons. And one of them being that it encourages us to think more creatively and broadly about how we could be solving problems. So when we get into the Opportunity Solution Tree framework, I'm really encouraging you to think about what other colleagues you might be able to invite into the discussion. This is a framework that's really great to use with other people. Okay, so as we go, I'm going to be interspersing some information about cognitive biases. And another reminder, I'm not a psychiatrist, but I've done a lot of reading. So I'm going to start us off here with a definition. In our personal and professional lives, we are constantly bombarded with massive amounts of information, and we can only process so much of it. Our brains are naturally helping us to manage this information by using shortcuts or heuristics to help us process more efficiently. And while those are generally beneficial, the shortcuts can at times reduce our ability to approach a problem objectively. This is especially true in circumstances where problems are big and complex, where there are limited resources and or a lot of constraints. So as many of you know, generally the working conditions of government. However, knowing about these biases is a very helpful place to start. And there are plenty of methods or frameworks that you can use to counteract the negative impact of those shortcuts. So as we bounce back and forth between cognitive biases and frameworks today, consider how an approach or a way of working is helping you to directly face the shortcuts that your brain is naturally taking so that you can be more intentional about the decision at hand. I'm going to start with an analogy here that I love to fall back on, which is I want you to imagine that whatever project that you're working on is like a road trip. So you know where you're starting because that's where you currently are, and hopefully you know your destination. In this case, we're going to Disneyland, so lucky us. But the opportunity solution tree, which we'll discuss in a moment, is going to help us plan our very next stop in the journey. And you might be wondering why we're not planning every detail of the road trip right now, and that leads to our very first bias, which is overconfidence. Now, this bias sneaks up, especially when we are projecting ourselves into the future. Think about any time when you've planned to incorporate a healthy habit in your life, like eating more fruits and vegetables, going to bed at a specific time, being more active. This bias means that we are likely to overestimate our abilities, but also we just can't predict the future. So for example, in a road trip, you're not able to predict when the people in your car might need a bathroom break or a snack, or when construction or an accident closes down the road. Instead, you have to be responsive to new information and to be able to adjust course while still generally driving towards your destination. And the same rules apply to a project as well. You won't be able to predict things like people getting sick or quitting or retiring or global pandemics or integral systems that suddenly need major repairs. So how can you overcome this particular bias? Instead of planning all the details up front, which is often referred to as waterfall in software development, I encourage you to trust your future selves to make the right decision. So focus today on making the decisions that you can with the information you have, and allow yourself plenty of opportunities to adjust course based on new information in the future. You might have heard the terms Agile, Lean, Scrum, and all of these are great frameworks that have their own pros and cons for developing software. But their underlying principles can be applied to almost anything that takes time to complete. So the key here is to focus on your North Star, or where you want to be, and then give yourself lots of room to learn and adjust as you go. And I want to qualify this by saying being iterative doesn't just mean breaking up a project into small parts and continuing down a planned path. The important part is the ways that you enable yourself to gather new data and information on a regular basis and to adjust as you go. It's the constant feedback loop that's really important here. A couple more biases. Next up is the bias towards action. And this one compels us to act even and make decisions even when we may not have all the information that we need. And again, this bias can especially appear when we are feeling pressure to move fast, which surprisingly happens a lot in government. And another bias, the anchoring bias, which means that we tend to place too much reliance on the very first idea or piece of information that we have. Now, to counteract these two biases, I'll introduce you to a design thinking framework called the double diamond. This is meant to describe the process of diverging and converging as you explore a problem and define a solution. So starting on the left, you diverge or go wide to broadly understand the challenge, and then you converge or narrow in on what part of the problem you will solve for. Next, you diverge again to consider all the ways you can solve a problem, and then you converge to pick one solution. The idea here is that you repeatedly give yourself time to gather information and learn before you anchor on one direction forward. Now, personally, I'm constantly using divergent and convergent thinking throughout a project to make sure I've thoroughly explored my options. I even do this when I'm picking something to eat for dinner. Generally, anytime you're making a decision that could have an impact, it's helpful to pause and investigate what you don't know or consider other approaches you could take. Remember, there's almost always multiple ways to approach or solve a problem. Now, the double diamond is the underlying foundation of the framework that we're here to talk about, the opportunity solution tree, which was developed by a brilliant product manager named Teresa Torres. And Teresa Torres also wrote a great book called Continuous Discovery Habits, which is about regularly engaging with user research to inform product decisions. The opportunity solution tree, however, is a way to visualize the different paths you might take to achieve an outcome. And I see two major benefits to this framework. First, sometimes when we're working on projects, we end up focusing on the solution that we are delivering instead of what that solution will help us achieve. That anchoring on the solution can prevent us from being able to consider other approaches. So the opportunity solution tree instead encourages us to anchor on the outcome, which I will talk a little bit more about in a moment. And second, it encourages divergent thinking about the different opportunities and solutions that you could prioritize as you are moving towards an outcome. Remember that double diamond. Okay, so I'm going to break this up a little bit more. Let's talk about the key terms within the opportunity solution tree. At the very top in this dark blue box, you'll see the word outcome. An outcome is a statement that demonstrates a measurable change in behavior, defines focus and scope, and is not solution specific. Writing an outcome is pretty tricky, so we'll come back to it. But I want you to think about our road trip analogy where our outcome is Disneyland, the direction that we're going. Under the outcome, there are many opportunities. An opportunity describes a pain point, a challenge, a desire that can be solved. It's really important in this instance to be thinking about levers that are within your control. And under each opportunity are many solutions. And a solution is a specific approach to addressing an opportunity. And lastly, under each solution are many experiments. An experiment is a small-scale test that gives you data or information to know whether or not to continue moving in that direction. And visually, the opportunity solution tree is a vertical hierarchy. In theory, you start at the top and you work your way down. However, I found time and time again that it can be helpful to bounce around the tree in order to illuminate what I do and don't know across all of the parts of the tree. So I will give you a real life example of the opportunity solution tree, but first let's go into a little more detail about the outcomes, because I found that this part of the framework can really trip people up when they're first starting out. So I'm going to be putting 3 statements up on screen, and I would love for you in chat to write whether or not you think it represents an outcome. So this first prompt, people seeking credentials through the state are able to get through the process faster and are more likely to get a job afterwards. All right, so pop in chat, tell me, is this an outcome or not? I'll give folks a few minutes. Okay, I've got a couple of people saying yes, outcome, outcome, outcome. All right, well, let's reveal. I would not call this an outcome, and here's why. This statement is breaking a couple of rules. First, it's not specific. It's actually 2 outcomes in one. First, it's focusing us on speeding up a process, and second, it's focusing us on improving access to jobs. And both are totally valid directions, but they could result in wildly different solutions depending on where we focus. Instead, it's better to narrow down on one. And second, it's using terms that appear to be measurable, like faster and more likely, but it's not actually giving us metrics that will help us know whether or not we've arrived at that destination. So these terms need to be paired with specific metrics in order to be valuable. All right, let's try another one. This one is a job board for newly state credentialed people increases the likelihood of them getting a job. All right, tell me again, is this an outcome or not? Okay, now I'm seeing a lot of no's and maybes. I'm not sure. That's okay. This is hard. Let's reveal it. Okay, this is getting us closer. It's more specific. It tells us about that we're focused on getting people jobs. However, it's still missing the mark because it's not measurable. And the other tricky thing about the statement is that the outcome might be impacted by many factors outside of our control in government. So, for example, it would be really difficult to know for a fact that a job board helped a person get a new job, right? That's a long feedback loop and feedback cycle. And I will come back, I promise, to explaining what outcomes are, because I know that this is tricky. But let's keep going through the third statement here, which is the process for getting credentialed as an electrician through the state takes no more than 10 days. One more time. Is this an outcome or not? This is my last one, I promise. Okay, great. I'm getting a lot of yeses. Outcome, yes. Hesitant, yes. Okay, yes. I would say this is an outcome. It's clearly scoped. It tells us exactly what we can expect when we've arrived at our destination, and it's measurable, 10 days. Now, I'm going to go through the whole tree with a real life example, and I promise we'll come back to the outcomes. Okay, so imagine that you work for Parks and Wildlife. Shout out to you, Kirk, for being here today. But and your boss has asked you to build a chatbot for the public-facing website. I'm using the example of a chatbot because, in my experience, this is a very common prompt in government. But imagine that they told you that the problem is that the website is very confusing to navigate and nobody can find what they need. Also, your boss is very intrigued by AI and wants you to explore what it would take to incorporate this into a chatbot. Now, you could turn around and immediately start building that chatbot, but do you really know enough about the problem? What if a chatbot is expensive and time-consuming and doesn't actually solve the problem? Or what if a chatbot gives a horrible answer to a simple question and someone writes an op-ed about how horrible the Park Service is and suddenly you're on the front page. This might be slightly dramatic, but more importantly, building the wrong solution to a problem will take away time and energy that you could be spending doing something else that is valuable. So instead, let's build out an opportunity solution tree to help us uncover what we don't know and what other approaches might look like. So first, I'm going to try to extract an outcome opportunity solutions from what we know so far. Now, we only need one outcome, and it should give us focus and scope. It's best if it's measurable and clearly communicates why the problem is important. Unfortunately, our boss didn't give us an outcome. Instead, I have many questions, like why is this problem the most important thing to solve for? And what do we expect to be improved as a result of building a chatbot? Is there a specific behavior that we can measure? So clearly I don't have enough information to define an outcome just yet, so I'll come back to it later. Now, an opportunity is a problem, a pain point, or a desire that can be solved by your organization. And we should have multiple opportunities under one outcome. In this case, our boss has given us one opportunity, which is that the website is confusing to navigate and nobody can find what they need. Now, lastly, our boss has given us one solution, which is a chatbot for the public website that is powered by AI. So now let's put what we know into an opportunity solution tree. Okay, it's looking pretty sparse, but that's okay because now we see that we are missing a whole bunch of information. We're missing an outcome. We're missing other opportunities, other solutions. So at this point, we know we need to go out and gather more information. So fast forward in time, imagine I did that. I took some time to interview people on staff and people that are using our website and visiting parks. I looked at the data we have, including website analytics. I read the strategic plan. I learned that as an organization, we are heavily focused on increasing attendance and reducing infractions at the park. So I was able to draft an outcome that is clearly measurable. State park attendance increases by 10% over a 6-month period, in parallel with a 15% decrease in reported infractions. I learned that people who access the website are frequently looking for information about preparing for a visit to a state park. And I learned that people are breaking lots of rules and visiting parks without knowing they need a reservation beforehand. So now I have 3 opportunities that I could target solutions for. I also came up with different solutions under each problem. This is when I would start to use convergent thinking to identify which approach is the right one to start with. And remember, right now, you don't have to plan your whole road trip. You just have to plan the next stop. So our last cognitive bias that we'll go over today is the affinity bias. This one describes the tendency to favor people who share similar interests, background, and experiences with us. But how does this impact our work? It means that we're often making decisions that that center our own experiences. Basically, we have the tendency to design for ourselves, which is why it's important to constantly be evaluating our decisions with other people, especially ones that are actually using or impacted by the thing that we are creating. So you might hear the term user research when we're talking about this. So that leads us to experiments. Now, remember, an experiment is a small-scale test that gives you data or information to know whether or not to continue moving in that direction. So in this case, let's imagine that our team decided to focus on redesigning the website. And in order to help us gather information about this approach, we will conduct an experiment. Now, maybe that means creating a paper prototype or conducting a test where we compare the homepage from before to a new redesign. Or maybe we go out and we do more interviews with people who are visiting state parks. But whatever it is, at the end of the experiment, we should have more confidence about how to move forward. Now, I've introduced this framework to a lot of people, and here are some of the things I've heard in real life. First, I've been told to build a specific solution, and there isn't room to consider other directions. How can I use the opportunity solution tree? In government, this scenario is common for a number of reasons. Maybe the requirements for the program or project you were given were written by legislators or a previous employee, or maybe they were written into a contract or a grant proposal, or maybe you just have a boss that thinks that they know the best path forward. And how you approach is really dependent on the constraints and opportunities that exist in your specific scenario. But I still think an opportunity solution tree is helpful because it helps you develop a fully formed case for why or why not to pursue a specific direction. At the very least, building evidence for why a predetermined path isn't solving a problem can help you make a stronger case for changing directions. I've also heard the project I'm working on is large and complex, and I can't just pick one outcome. And I feel this. I have worked on a lot of complex problems in government, and I recognize the challenge of having to slim down. But I would also encourage you to remember the overconfidence bias, which means you and your team only have so many hours in a day. And while it sometimes feels necessary to try to take on everything, that approach is likely to end up increasing the time it takes for you to learn new information that can help you build confidence or adjust course as you go. Meaning, what I mean by that is, like, sometimes if you take on everything, it will take months and months and years to get something out. And then by the time it's released, you may have built the wrong thing and not know it, have to start all over. So all this to say, defining scope is hard, but it's so necessary. I've also heard, can I skip experiments or user research in other ways? I feel very confident in my decisions or what I know, or I don't have time. And in this case, remember that affinity bias. The risk of moving forward without learning regularly is that we introduce the risk of making a decision that ends up having massive negative consequences later. So instead, you want to give yourself time and space to learn and adjust as you go, so that you don't have to rework everything when it's more expensive in terms of time and resources. And lastly, something else I've heard is, can I use the opportunity solution tree as a source of truth? And I encourage you, again, to use this framework however it's valuable for you. For me personally, I found that it's helpful at a point in time when I'm working with a team to make a decision about how to move forward. I found it to be less useful in being a source of truth that I constantly update, but that's just me, and maybe you'll feel differently once you start to apply it. Okay, so let's recap some of the key points for this framework. One, the key is to focus on an outcome rather than a solution or output, and to use divergent thinking to consider multiple ways to approach the problem at hand. I've also, again, included the definitions for each of these terms on the slide. And in a moment, I'm going to share some quick resources in case you're interested in learning more before we move on to questions. Okay, so some things that you might be interested in reading more. Teresa Torres has an incredible blog post series on producttalk.org. And there's a specific product or long blog post about opportunity solution trees that she wrote in 2023 that I would highly recommend. The book Thinking Fast and Slow, which you may have heard of, is very popular a couple of years ago, but this is really great for understanding a little bit more about how our brains work, and more about those mental shortcuts that we're making. And then two other frameworks and books a framework and a book that I have found helpful in the past in really orienting towards outcomes over output, which is actually a pretty tough transition. So I'm going to leave this up on the screen. I think this is a good time to transition over to questions. And Hannah, I'll look to you. Where do you want to start?
Sure. Thank you, Stephanie. So just wanted to remind folks that they can use either the chat or raise your hand, and I will call on you. I'm going to take us off recording now.